Hello, everyone. In today's stream, what we're going to do is we're going to go over the stages of narcissistic abuse. A bunch of different people have asked me to go over like the spidey sense kind of feeling you get when you're with a cluster B person, whether it's narcissistic or whether it's borderline, for example. And we're going to go through the stages and we're going to tell people how do you recognize this when it happens. We're going to tell you also what to look for in each stages. But of course, the main point here is to spot this in the beginning and nip it in the butt before anything can go too wrong. Because if you don't know what hit you, you can be in for a wild ride, boy, let me tell you. And of course, that's how a lot of people find the manosphere after an episode with a narcissistic or a borderline woman. But all of what I'm going to talk about here, it also applies to women too. It applies to them and narcissistic and borderline men, and I don't want to exclude them from this either. But in the beginning, and this has been true for me, whether it's a romantic relationship or even a family relationship, but the first thing you kind of notice is you get kind of like this energetic charge in you when you're around someone that's cluster B. And I think this is especially true for people that had a narcissistic parent growing up. We were groomed and we had that experience, and it makes us that much more likely to be with a cluster B individual as an adult. And, a lot of people who had a narcissistic parent, they either become narcissistic themselves, borderline, or see PTSD. All of them can be very likely. So the first thing we'll notice is that kind of energetic charge where the person feels otherworldly. And that's what I always notice first. And again, this used to happen with family even too, where it kind of feels like you're on a different realm. And it can seem a little bit magical and a little bit fun. And I'd be lying if I said some of the best times I've ever had, they were with like cluster B folks. It just kind of spliced together and it was what it was. They're the kinds of people that when I'm on my deathbed, I'll probably remember some of those narcissistic love bombing type times. Now, that's not to say they ended well. They certainly didn't. But that energy, that's the first thing to notice. And then, of course, we'll go into the love bombing phase. What do we notice in the love bombing phase? We'll notice a narcissistic person, they're not going to share much about themselves. What they will do, on the other hand, is ask us a lot about us and mirror all of our likes and dislikes. They're going to tell us that we're the most special person they've ever met. They never met anyone like us before, and this seems different. And all of that is to suck you in to their love bombing spell. And again, if you're not ready for this, this can be devastating, especially as a man, because let's face it, it doesn't happen to most men. Most women do not do that to the average man. So when a narcissistic woman comes along and then starts love bombing, and another thing I've heard is a lot of people on the spectrum, guys on the spectrum, they will also often attract cluster B type women. For whatever reason, it can be kind of like a predator-prey type dynamic. So the narcissistic woman, she will love bomb, and she'll also probably use sex. And again, if a guy's not grounded and happy and single, and he's not kind of good on his own already, he is much more susceptible to this. He is much more susceptible to getting caught up in the love bombing and the magical feeling. But when we're good on our own, we're practicing radical self-respect, we'll be able to see through some of this stuff. And we should ask the narcissistic person a little bit about themselves. Get them to share some things, because that's one thing they don't often like to do in the beginning. They want to just keep it on us, focus on us, mirror the likes and dislikes, agree with everything, tell us how attractive they think we are. And it's just to blow your head up a little bit. And it works really too. If you're not ready for it, it works. So we have to be ready for it. So what happens next? So then we're going to go into the devaluing phase. Once they've gotten their hooks in us a little bit and they've blown our heads up, we also have to watch out for when they ask us questions about our vulnerabilities, because they will use us our vulnerabilities against us later. They do this in the love bombing phase because we're buttered up. We're much more open and vulnerable. And some of the things we tell them in the love bombing phase, they will begin to use against us later in the devalue and the discard. So on to the devalue though. What does that look like? The devalue phase is when they start to get a little distant and the narcissistic individual is no longer getting the same high from us that they did in the beginning. And I think it's important to mention a lot of the narcissists, they aren't consciously aware that they're doing this, a lot of them. They go through the stages, but they don't understand why they go through the stages. And so what happens is they think in the love bombing phase, they met someone magical and this person's going to cure everything for them. It's going to make everything all better. But then what happens is the person shows that they're human and the narcissist can't idealize them the way they used to in the beginning. And this is the beginning of the devalue stage. In the devalue stage, they get a little bit distant. They'll get hot and cold. They might start to notice some more faults in us. They might pick at us, poke at us, tell us some things we're doing wrong. And it's the beginning of the end is really what it is. And I was thinking about this the other day, but what's the difference between a narcissistic devalue phase and just the natural course of a relationship and the honeymoon period ending? And my answer to that would be this. It's that in a normal relationship, when the honeymoon period ends, you may still feel safe in the relationship. You're still on the same team. But when it's a cluster B narcissistic relationship, that kind of feeling of safety isn't there. And the devalue, it can be much more extreme, and there can be abuse thrown in there too. And so it's not quite the same as just a regular relationship endings the honeymoon period. And those are the things to watch out for. So this devalue phase, we're not working as the source of supply we were in the beginning. And the narcissist begins to notice this. And they notice it because they don't feel the same anymore. They kind of feel like antsy. They'll be a little distant. Maybe they'll be more busy than they normally were. But they start to get a foot outside the door. But they never forget to keep on love bombing too throughout this whole thing, because they want to keep us on our toes. They want to keep us on the hook. So they'll mix it back and forth a little bit. It's not just going to be straight to discard. No, no, no. The devalue wouldn't be as effective unless it was a little bit of both. So the devalue phase might happen for a little while. It can be various amounts of time too. It could be quick or it can be dragged out a little bit. Either one, it can happen either way. But then after the devalue phase, we have the discard phase. Now, this is where I've seen a difference between narcissistic men and narcissistic women. Narcissistic women, they often say very similar things, such as, I just want to be alone right now. We should just be friends. Or I need to work on me, take care of my side of the street. All the things, although they don't say take care of their side of the street. They're not very good at personal responsibility and accountability. But what they do think is they just want to get away. And they don't really want to be alone. Let's never get that twisted. They really just want to get with other sources of supply. Whether it's a man or woman, it is true for them both. They just want new supply. And that's it. And so if it's the woman and she says she wants to be alone, which of course means she just wants to get with other dudes. But the guy, if he's in the trauma bond, which if it's gotten this far, he probably is. But if he's in the trauma bond, he'll be devastated by this point because she'll be cold. He'll probably be trying to jump through all of her hoops, but to no avail. Nothing the guy can do can make her happy. And the guy's devastated. He'll try to do anything to make her happy, but nothing will make her happy because she doesn't even know what's going to make her happy for that matter. So it's a losing battle for everyone. And I've seen a lot of guys come to this predicament, and it's not a good sight. Now, for guys that are narcissistic that do this to women, it's a little bit different because guys, they'll still want to sleep with women, regardless of what phase of the narcissistic abuse they're in. They will still sleep with women, and they'll still do whatever they want in the sexual realm, but also be open to new sources of supply too. It's just one of the differences between the men and the women. But back to the narcissistic women. Yes, this is live. I'm sorry. But if you want to send a super chat, I'll pause this for a second. Would you like to see a domestic abusive person in silence? Yeah, I'll get to this in the end. So narcissistic women, once the guy's not working for her anymore, she's gone. And the guy's just, she's toast. He's toast at this point. He's in the trauma bond, and he thinks her presence will heal him. And that's one of the indicators to know that the guy's still stuck in it. When he thinks that that woman coming back will heal him, that's how you know he's not in a good spot. That's how you know he's still in the trauma bond. Now, if it's the guy doing this to a woman, this is where it might be a little more abusive. The gaslighting might be turned up a notch, and the real abuse will come to the surface. And all of the internal rage and angst and uncomfortability that is on the inside of the narcissist, they project that outward onto us, is what they will do. And they have a lot of turmoil. At some point, I'm going to make a video about the narcissistic codependent relationship, where they are really just flip sides of the same coin. And the recovery process for both of them is kind of similar, but the narcissistic person is much less likely to work on themselves than the codependent person, but they are both other-centered. So we've gone through the discard now, and the female narcissist, she's still going to try to keep the guy on the hook a little bit. Maybe if they're still friends on social media, following each other, she'll still make sure she's liking his posts and comments just to try to keep the embers alive so it's not completely dead. But what's happened at this point is the guy, he's probably trying to chase her down, and all it's making the woman do is lose more interest. And the very fact that he's trying turns her off even more. So maybe eventually the guy lets it go, even though he's hurt. And then time goes by, and then you get the love bomb hoovering. And again, it's a little different depending on whether it's a man or a woman doing this. So if it's a woman, she'll come back with the love bomb hoover, and she might have seen 100 different dudes at this point, but she'll still come back because she still wants to make sure she's got sources of supply on hand that can make her feel good about herself, to pump her up, inflate her ego. And if it's an attractive woman, that's not very hard for them, right? They got tons of potential suitors. That's just how it is today in the sexual marketplace of today. Now, if it's a guy, sometimes women may actually want to not talk to the dudes anymore that are narcissistic. And then the narcissistic dude, he will rage, and he might stalk the girl. He might not leave her alone. He doesn't know how to take no for an answer. And that can be pretty scary for a woman, honestly. That's not very fun. And then the police and whomever, they don't really do too much in that scenario. There's not much they can do. But that's a pretty scary feeling for the woman in that sense. And unfortunately, oftentimes there's kids involved, and then a hard no contact is pretty difficult. So whether you're a man or a woman and you were with a narcissistic individual and you had a child together, yeah, hard no contact isn't going to go well, right? You're going to have to probably do gray rock, and you're going to have to do least amount of contact necessary. But whatever you do, you don't want to give them too much of your energy and tell them too much about yourself so that they can start gaslighting you and suck you in to the whole routine. That's why they call it hoovering, the Hoover vacuum, the sucking back in. And let's face it, guys can be pretty susceptible to this, especially when a woman's offering sex again. That love bomb hoover can be much more effective. It takes a lot of practice, takes a lot of radical self-respect to see through that and to say no. Now for women, it's a lot easier to have sex, but they still like that emotional connection. And if they're in the trauma bond, they might think back to all the great times they had in the love bombing phase. Guys do this too, of course. But they might think back to the love bombing phase and say, Why can't it be like that again? And they don't remember the bad times anymore. They only want to remember the good. So these are all the stages here, and they can repeat indefinitely if the person who's the victim of this, and I don't even like using that word because it's not supposed to be a destination. It's only supposed to be a step and then a step on the path to recovery. Don't stay a victim. If you learn anything on this channel, don't stay a victim. Move through. That's the goal here. So you finally recognized it, you see it, and if you chop it off with no contact, the trauma bond can be broken. If you try to maintain contact and you haven't had kids with the person, and then there's really no reason to have contact with them at this point. But if you do, it's going to be tough to sever that bond, because I know when I was in this situation years ago, it didn't take much to keep that alive. Just a little bit of contact here and there, hanging out here and there with some sex. That's all it took to keep it alive. It wasn't until I cut off all of the contact for months on end did the trauma bond break. But that's what it takes. And after the whole ordeal here, what do we take from the whole thing? That we got to take a look at our side of the street. We probably weren't happy and single, for one. We overlooked red flags, probably because we were not happy and single, or we wanted sex, or we wanted good feelings. But for whatever the reason, we overlooked them probably. Maybe we had weak boundaries, right? Maybe we were more codependent. But there's always something that we could have done better. Now, it doesn't mean that everything that happened to us was our fault, but it means there was probably things we can do better. Very rarely is it 100% the victim and then 100% the prey. That's not how this works here usually. It takes two to tango. And that's all we can do anyway. I mean, if we blame other people, where's our power when we blame other people? We have no power when we blame other people. But our power is taking a look at our side of the street and working within our circle of influence. That's the name of the game here. And unfortunately for people, if they don't recognize the pattern and break the trauma bond, that cycle can continue and repeat for years. And it can be devastating. And I see women and men both. They can both suffer from that cycle for years and years and years. It's a sad thing. But that's what practicing radical self-respect is. To break that cycle. That's what you're supposed to do. But let's go over some of these comments here. I see the devalues 2/3 months in. I was even told that was the honeymoon period. I'd never heard the phrase before that. So I'm not sure I understand this question. See the devalue. I was even told that was a honeymoon period. Yeah, I mean, like I was saying before. Let's see. Like I was saying before, there is a difference between the ending of a normal relationship's honeymoon period and then the devalue phase of narcissistic abuse. In a normal relationship, you can still feel safe. And it's all about the dynamic in there. But when you're in narcissistic abuse, you don't feel safe. You're probably walking on eggshells. They probably started gaslighting you a little bit, finding your faults, picking at you. And it's certainly not a safe feeling scenario. But you'll get some ups and downs and drug-like spikes. That's another thing that you don't get as much of in a healthy relationship. It's not as much of a drug. It's just not. It's more of like a stable kind of thing. And I was talking to a girl not that long ago, and she was telling me how her mother said, if you instantly mesh and connect, that's dysfunction. I'm not sure if that's 100% true, but I can see what she meant. But let's see here. So, would you say a lot of domestic abusers? Yes, I would say most of them do. Now, it's not going to be 100% of the time, but often they will. I know people I know have had narcissistic personality disorder, maybe bordering on antisocial personality disorder, but they have very fragile egos. They're very sensitive to criticism, so that if you brush up on their pain body, and they'll just project and push back and gaslight all sorts of trauma and nonsense that's in them. And they can go wild. And this is the malignant narcissists in particular. They can be pretty demonic. So if you insult them, which isn't that difficult because they are very sensitive. So if you insult them, they might push back and go into a rage. That's happened to me with family before, where you just say one thing, or one of my other favorites, if you just match their energy and do what they do to you and see how they like it. And chances are they hate it. But here's the thing. If we match someone's energy and just kind of do to them what they do to us and they don't like it, that's another cue that's probably a narcissistic person, and we should get the hell out of there. Now, I want to make this distinction too. Now, there is a difference between narcissistic personality disorder and just having narcissistic traits. There's 9 traits of narcissistic personality disorder. In order to qualify, you got to have 5 of the 9. I'll probably do another video about this at some point, but you got to have 5 of the 9. Now, a lot of people have narcissistic traits. And here's the other tricky part, though. If someone has CPTSD or is on the spectrum or has BPD or NPD, they can all act pretty similar. But rather than focus on the labels, I want people to focus on the behaviors. Toxic behaviors are toxic behaviors. And I think whether we're receiving the toxic behaviors or we're the person doing the toxic behaviors, I think the solutions are the same. If we find ourselves doing the toxic behaviors, and I can be sensitive to criticism myself. I have narcissistic traits, totally. As I think a lot of people that are on YouTube or other social media platforms do. But the solution is to take a step back and respond rather than react. If we're on the receiving end of this stuff, I think the solutions are also the same. Place boundaries, because we teach people how to treat us. And if our boundaries are not being respected, we can always choose to walk away. Now, the problem that happens in these narcissistic codependent dynamics is there's a trauma bond, and one side usually isn't able to walk away anymore. They feel stuck, and they don't realize they can, but they can, but they don't. And the only time I would say for people not to do that is if there's physical abuse involved and there's a woman. When I worked for the self-deletion hotline, they always told us, you don't tell a woman in that situation to leave. You tell them to notify friends and family and make a plan to leave, because that can be a very dangerous situation. So keep your eyes open for that situation too. But where was I going with that? Oh yeah, people acting the same. So boundaries are going to be important. And so regardless of the cause, if someone's continuing to act toxically towards us and gaslighting us and disrespecting our boundaries, the solutions are the same. So I don't want people to get too caught up in the labels. Oh, that's not narcissistic, or that's not this, that's not. Forget about all that. Watch the behaviors. The only time I would say it really does matter, the labels, like if someone's full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, 99 times out of 100, that person will not change. So keep that in mind too. So let's go here. Oh, thanks, my man. I appreciate that, Dee Dee. I was also asked, do you feel like you're on eggshells? She smiled when she asked, as if she was happy. It didn't make sense at the time, but aha, that's exactly right. So one of the other telltale signs that we're in a narcissistic type relationship is we feel the need to walk on eggshells around them. And so what does that feel like? Often it's because we were codependent at a time, for one. But what is this really? It's kind of being fearful of the other person's response. A cluster B person, they can be very volatile and very unpredictable. And what happens is you don't want to upset them, because if you do, they'll come jump down your throat. and they'll be abusive. They'll gaslight. They'll pick. They'll tell you all the things you should have been doing better. Or you don't know what version of them you're going to get. You might get the happy version that's a little more in the love bombing mood that day, but you just don't know. Hence the walking on eggshells. And so for me, walking on eggshells is basically me being afraid of loss, I think, in my own life. So when I did this, especially when I was younger, what would happen is I was afraid a woman would leave. And so I didn't own, like me, I didn't own my thoughts. I would try to like twist and contort myself to that person so that they would like me. But if you refer back to my first date mistakes video, that is absolutely the wrong thing to do, right? We got to own our thoughts and don't try to be bending and contorting ourselves so the girl will like us. Like, that's the worst thing to do, honestly. That's how we're failing their crap tests. Or if we're too sensitive to their moods, same thing. But when we're walking on eggshells, that's kind of what we're doing with that, right? We're kind of unsure. We're not owning it. And we don't want to get too many negative reactions. But it's a very unpleasant experience. And I think a lot of it stems from when we were kids, probably had a narcissistic parent, and they ruled like a tyrant, probably, where you weren't allowed to have your own opinions. You weren't allowed to say no. You weren't allowed to have your own boundaries. And so you learned to conform. Or what I would do in those scenarios is, I just kind of pulled back and retreated. And they just got like a shell version of me. And I would save the real version of me for when they went to bed. And then I would feel at peace when they were finally gone. I think a lot of people have this story when it comes to narcissistic parents, but that's because we weren't accepted as who we were during the day. We had to fit their ideals because they are certainly very controlling, very judgmental, not very accepting either. And it can be really a pain in the ass. It's not fun. And I think those kinds of kids, they're the ones that often act out. Like if they go off to college or something, they go wild because they're finally free. It can feel like a prison, honestly. But it also can be very similar to people-pleasing behavior. So people pleasers, they stem from the same kind of environment where they're not allowed to have their own thoughts. They're guilted and shamed for having their own thoughts. And so they learn to kind of just go along to get along. And then they become people pleasers. And for people who are more on the codependent side and the people pleaser side, it is important for them to learn how to be selfish in the right ways. And that's the exact opposite, I would say, to someone who's more narcissistic. They need to be more selfless. The codependent person needs to be more selfish. We'll get into this more in the narcissistic / codependent video, but the codependent guy or woman, they have to learn to be comfortable saying no, to be comfortable with conflict and disagreement, because that's probably where they struggle. But I don't want to give it all away here. But I think that's really it. I think if you take anything from this video, just remember, if you're with a borderline or a narcissistic individual, we were probably not completely innocent in the scenario either. It doesn't mean what happened to us was all our fault, but what we can do is take a look at our side of the street and see what we could have done better. How could we have recognized red flags in the beginning? How could we have maybe been more content while we were single? These are the things that we could have taken a look at. So remember to like the video out there if you've gotten this far. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And remember, I work with people that have been in these kinds of scenarios. Whether you're the codependent, whether you're the narcissist, I do help everybody. Although, let's face it, a lot of the narcissistic individuals will not be reaching out for help. But sometimes borderlines do, sometimes, and codependents do. And I'm here for the kinds of people that want to learn how to practice radical self-respect in their lives. So reach out to me if that sounds like something you'd be interested in. So thank you very much, everyone. unless there's any other questions, I'm going to sign out here. All right. Farewell, everyone.